Okay, friends, welcome to what, at least for this series, is going to be the last in our series of Oh, the Places You'll Go. I'm calling it the Easter edition. We're going to be in Jerusalem, and we're going to be in Rome, and we're even going to be here in Charlotte in the course of our conversation. But I want to think Easter's just happened, at least at the time that we're shooting this. So I wanted to think about some resurrection places. I wanted to begin in Jerusalem at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We were there before during Holy Week. In this one church, there is housed the place, they both would have been outside originally, right? Where Jesus was crucified, Calvary, but then also the place where he was buried, the tomb, right? So inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and how do they know these things? In the 4th century, Helen, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, went to Jerusalem and said, where did these things happen? And there were people who said, it was right over there. And some people wonder about this, but they actually, one time I got the archaeologist Shimon Gibson to take me down to the basement of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where tourists just can't go. And he showed me a graffito, whatever, that they found on the wall down there that dates to about 100 years after the death of Jesus. And somebody scribbled a boat on the wall there, and it says, Lord, we came. Now, why would somebody write, the Lord we came, by this grave down there, right? So the early pilgrims within 100 years of Jesus' death are already going to this very place. Now, inside the big church, there's a little church, a little chapel. It's called the Edicule. Tiny little chapel is built over the place where Jesus' tomb would have been. And this is probably the authentic spot. And usually when I go there, there's a long line. I don't mean a 20-minute line. Sometimes it's a 2-3 hour line. I've stood in it before. Sometimes people just get tired, don't want to stand in it that long. You stand in the line for a long time, and finally you go inside, and you have to bend over to go in, and then there's a very small place inside there where you can kneel inside the Edicule. They don't let you take photos there, but National Geographic did a special on the renovation of this space recently. They took some photos while they were in there, and you come in, so it's very sacred and holy. There's candles burning, you kneel briefly. It's really moving. It's not what you would picture like in the big grave tomb like you'd see in the movies. Of course not. They built a little chapel over it. So resurrection stories. You know, the resurrection stories in the New Testament, there's several of them, things that happen. So one is Jesus goes to Emmaus. You know, the two disciples are on the road to Emmaus. Jesus catches up to them. They don't recognize him at first. He talks to them. They invite him to stay. They eat together. They talk about the scriptures together. So then their eyes were open and they realized it was the Lord. When you go to Israel, if you ask somebody, where is Emmaus? They'll say, well, which one? There are 3 different locations that compete. Like, we're the Emmaus. Everybody wants to be, right? You get tourists there. So no one knows where that happened. Caravaggio, though, painted this moment, right, where Jesus is there with the disciples. And I love the energy in his painting. It's almost like they're springing up with the news, the realization of who he is. That's so beautiful. Caravaggio also painted another resurrection scene where, you know, the story, it's in John chapter 20, where Jesus appears to the disciples. They're behind locked doors. And he comes, he breathes on them, and then Thomas has his doubts, and Jesus says, you know, put your finger in the wounds. Caravaggio captures that moment where Thomas actually touches the wounds of Jesus. Kind of a graphic painting that he did. I like that idea that the risen Jesus, he's still got his scars. Right? It's almost like it's a badge of honor. It might be like, you know, a woman's stretch marks or a scar that you might have from some heroic act you had in battle. It tells something about who you are a lot of times when you have a scar. Jesus has his scars. Another moment is in John chapter 21. The disciples are out fishing. They see somebody by the shore. It's Jesus. Good grief. He's cooking breakfast for them. It's amazing. And they go ashore, and this is where Jesus has the conversation with Simon Peter, where he asks him 3 times, do you love me? That's really the question for all of us at the end of the day. It's not just, you know, do you go to church? Are you a nice person? Do you know how to judge other people? Jesus just wants to know, do you love me? Peter 3 times says, Lord, you know that I love you. I love that Jesus gave him 3 chances on that because Peter had denied him 3 times. It's like the 3 count toward healing. Then he says, go and feed my sheep. There's a statue by the edge of the Sea of Galilee that I really love. It's sort of Jesus, commissioning Peter. Peter's just protested his love, and he says, go and feed my sheep. That's for all of us. That's a wonderful thing. There's some other places of death, burial, resurrection that I think are theologically interesting. One is what I always say is the most interesting place in the city of Rome. Now, people go there and they want to see the Sistine Chapel. They want to see St. Peter's. They want to see the Colosseum. They want to see the Forum. I tell people the most interesting thing in Rome is called the Scavi, S-C-A-V-I. It's under the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica. So this is way down. They excavated under the church years ago. And what they found there was what they expected to find there. They found a necropolis. That's a city of the dead. It was a cemetery. Back in the day, it was an open-air cemetery. It was outside the city because Romans didn't want to deal with death. And that's where Peter would have been buried, according to tradition, and most likely. When the Emperor Constantine, his mother Helen, decided to build on sacred places, they said, where was Peter buried? They came there and they built the original St. Peter's over that. It lasted until the 1500s when the St. Peter's that we know today was built. So they excavated this whole cemetery out. And it's called the Scavi, and you go down there and you do a tour of it, and they lead you through all of these, mausoleums and burial places until you finally come to the place that historically marks the grave of Simon Peter. That's a pretty cool one, the burial of Peter, moving place. Also in Rome, there's some other places that really matter. Catacombs. Sometimes people hear about the catacombs, they want to visit them. And a lot of people go to the ones out on the Appian Way. They're certainly interesting, but there are always a whole bunch of tour buses there and too many people that are crowding the place. So I always take people to the Catacomb of Priscilla, Priscilla. They have really friendly nuns there, and I've never seen a tour bus where it's too crowded. So a catacomb, it's just, these are underground burial chambers. They would cut these shelves, these niches into the rock, and they would lay the bodies there. And Christians loved to go to the catacombs. Now, most people in the Roman world, they avoided places of death. Christians loved places of death and burial. Why? Because they believed in an afterlife. They believed that the tomb was that was like the closest you could get to heaven. Like it's just on the other side, because that's where the dead people went to go to be with God. So they went and worshiped and prayed in the catacombs all the time. And the cool thing about the Catacomb of Priscilla is that they did all this interesting art on the wall. They just painted on the walls over where their loved ones lay, over where the places where they worshiped there. In the art, it's always interesting stuff. They chose moments in the Bible that seemed to connote survival after death, that indicated resurrection. So what I'm showing you on the screen now, it's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know the story from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. These three young men refuse to bow down to the emperor. He throws them in the fiery furnace, but they survive, right? Because there's a fourth one. God's very presence enables them to survive that. That was a popular image. There are quite a number of others. They would celebrate communion in the catacombs. So there are a lot of images there of the Last Supper. I bought one on a little wooden placard when we were there, and when I brought it home, I was going to hang it in our house somewhere. We wound up putting it just above the door where you go from our kitchen into our dining room. I don't remember to look at it all the time, but sometimes I do. I look up and I think about those early Christians gathering in the catacombs. They were beginning to be persecuted then. It's just so moving. They went down there, they worshiped, they celebrated the Lord's Supper. They remembered the body and blood of Christ being shed, poured out for them. Such a beautiful thing. While we're in Rome, I'll take you to a couple of other churches that involve death. So there's a church that not many tourists go to called San Agostino. It's not too far from the Piazza Navona. It's sort of a Baroque style church, which I'm not really that fond of. San Agostino, like St. Augustine. He's not buried there. His mother, though, Monica, is buried there. Monica, the mother of Augustine. They had that unusual relationship that I may have told you about at some point. She was a very holy woman. Her husband was a terror, goodness, a cruel man. He dies at some point, but she prays for the salvation of her son. She prays for his soul. She's worried about him. He's brilliant. He's successful. but he's not in the Christian fold yet. She prays and prays and prays for him. And at one point, she was in the Basilica in Milan praying, just pouring out her soul, sobbing. And Ambrose, the bishop, saw her. And he said to her, "It is not possible that the child of so many tears could perish." It takes Augustine a long time. He finally converts and becomes one of the great saints, one of the great teachers in the life of the church. So Monica, therefore, becomes sort of the patron saint of mothers who are worried about their children, who pray for their children. So in the church San Agostino, Augustine's mother, Monica, is buried there. Now, first they'd buried her in a little town called Ostia that's on the coast near Rome. But then after they built this church, they moved her sarcophagus there, and they didn't just leave it on the floor. They perched it up on the wall where everybody could see it well. It's kind of odd. So you see the sarcophagus of Monica, she's in there. And the first time I went into this church, it's not lit, it's not a big tourist place. So I go in, there's barely candlelight, and I hear something. And I walk over toward where I think that sarcophagus is going to be, and I notice there's a woman kneeling under it, and she's weeping, she's wailing, and I hear her saying something over and over. She's saying, "Mio bambino, mio bambino." It's my little child, my little child. I just sat down and prayed behind her. I didn't want to interrupt. I couldn't have talked to her anyway. I don't know what was wrong with her mio bambino. I don't know. But parents with children that are sick, that are lost, whatever, Catholic parents have prayed to Monica for years. It was just such a beautiful sight seeing that. We've talked a good number of times in the series about St. Francis of Assisi. Francis died, right outside the city of Assisi. Down where the lepers lived, where the poor were. That was really fitting for him. That's where his real life work had been, not in the wealthy, comfortable part of the city. So he died there and is buried. And before we get that, I love the scene of his death, the Giotto. It's actually this painting, this fresco is in the Bardi Chapel of the Santa Croce Church in Florence. People miss it all the time. I almost did. You go in Santa Croce, they've got the tomb of Michelangelo there. The tomb of Machiavelli is a monument to Dante. I mean, it's like the Hall of Fame of Western civilization in Santa Croce. But actually, if you look at the little Bardi Chapel, there are all these magnificent frescoes that Giotto did around the death of Francis. It shows his brothers around his deathbed, wailing, being attentive to him, being tender with him. It's so beautiful. Francis, of course, is buried in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Now, that basilica didn't exist when he died. They built it to house his body. And it's one of those joke churches in a way. It's a beautiful church, fabulous Gothic structure. St. Francis would have said, "Please do not build such a church for me." He would have wanted the money to go for the poor, of course. Well, he's buried in the crypt of that church. And what I love about the way he's buried is you go down into the crypt and you see his tomb, which is lovely, but then his closest friends are buried in a circle around him, right? Brother Leo, Brother Sylvia, they're just buried in a circle. So he's buried for eternity, not just with his physical family, but with his spiritual family, with his closest friends who are committed to Christ together, sort of a neighborhood awaiting the resurrection there. Such a wonderful thing. The most interesting burial in the city of Assisi, though, is in the church that's called Santa Chiara. Santa Chiara. It's a beautiful church. Santa Chiara, that's Latin for St. Clare. Clare was the young woman who was enamored with Francis. I don't mean in a romantic sense, although the movies have done it that way. She heard Francis preaching. She saw Francis preaching. She said it looked like he was dancing. He was just so full of the love of the Lord and his zeal for the gospel. And so she started a movement of women. Before that, it had always been men, the brothers of Francis. She started a movement, the Poor Clares. A lot of wealthy women, like Francis did, they were giving up their wealth to reach out in ministry to the poor. So Chiara, she was just a wonderful saint. She outlived Francis by quite a few years. She finally died in older age, and they buried her at first in a church called San Giorgio. Well, they decided that that church wasn't really sufficient for such a great saint, so they tore it down. They built this church that we have now, Santa Chiara, for her to be buried in. When they exhumed her body, now, they weren't doing embalming in those days. They just buried bodies. So it took them 7 years to finish this church. So when they dug up her body, they expected it to be, just gone, right? Just nothing but bones left. Well, they dug up her body after 7 years, and her body was perfectly intact. What was that? So she's known as one of the incorruptibles, and there are a couple of hundreds of them that are authenticated in Roman Catholicism. People who died, and after however many years, their bodies have not decomposed. Some people that you've heard of, Francis Xavier, Catherine of Genoa. There are quite a number of incorruptibles. It's amazing. So they took her incorruptible body and they reburied it in the crypt there of Santa Chiara. You can come and see it today. Now, if you see it today, though, it's odd. You can't just see her body as is, because what happened is back in the 1800s, her body was dirty from just years. And somebody decided to give her a bath, and when they applied, of course, the soap and the water, it made her skin black, and it just began to deteriorate. Like they ruined one of the incorruptibles. So they put her body in this casing to protect it moving into the future. So that's what you actually see in the crypt. Claire's body is there behind glass. You can see it's amazing. And I don't know what this means, right? A lot of people say, "Oh, that's nonsense." Okay, that's fine. I first went there with a friend of mine who's a Catholic priest, and I was puzzled by this. I'd never heard of the incorruptibles. And I said, "Philip, what's this about? What does this mean?" And he said, "What I believe is," he said, "it's a small miracle that God grants to us to help us believe in the resurrection to come. Like everybody's not incorruptible, but occasionally there's one, and that's a sign for the rest of us that in one day there will be the resurrection of the body, not just the immortality of the soul, but a body that's resurrected." What do you think? Wow. That's an amazing thing. So I think about Jesus' tomb in Jerusalem, and then these other places of burial where it's surrounded by great hope, great faith in eternal life. It makes me think about cemeteries everywhere. In a way, Jesus' tomb becomes one with all of our cemeteries everywhere, where my grandparents are buried, where many people that I've loved have been buried, in columbariums. We have a columbarium at our church. I love, when I first came here 20 years ago, the Parish Life building had just been finished. And I heard that they had commissioned a statue of an angel to go in the columbarium. And I have to be honest with you. I told Linda Hallfield this, who headed that endeavor up. When I heard that, my heart just sank. I thought, oh, they've got an angel. I was picturing one of these kind of, white, sugary, sweet-looking cherubs, chubby. Boy, this angel in our columbarium, she's gorgeous. She's strong. She's just beautiful. She has fabulous. I love her. She's absolutely wonderful. And we have so many people that we love who are there. Some of us watching this video will be there one day. Our building is under construction. So right now we don't have access to the columbarium. The ground isn't there anymore, and it's a mud pit below where the ground is. So they're doing major construction. We'll be able to have access to that columbarium again when construction is done. And what's really going to be a great delight is that columbarium area is going to be expanded and beautified over what was already a beautiful area. I'm showing you a few pictures of this as I'm talking about this. The columbarium is going to be more beautiful, more spacious. It's a place, it's not a place for worship, yet it is worship, right? Christians have always gathered where those that they loved and have lost rest. And partly it's to remember them and to give thanks for them and to grieve over them. But it's also a sign of our faith in God that we believe it's not all over. There is a resurrection. There is an eternal life to come. When I think of, the places we'll go, we go a lot of places in this world, but it all comes down to where we go at the end of our life, of course. Friends, thank you for joining me during this series. It's been great fun for me to take you to some places that I've been and love. And of course, we'll have other series that are coming, so stay tuned. We'll keep putting out video content like this. But thank you so much for watching and thinking and working on some of these things within your own heart.